Well, I'm going to let Robby give a little bit more of his background growing up as a Baptist. And one of the things that stands out for me, and I'll let him expand on it, is having made it all the way to seminary at no slouch of a Baptist seminary, Southwestern, right? In Dallas. This is like what would you say, the Oxford of Baptists, if that's not an oxymoron. It was then that he finally realized that the Southern Baptist Church was founded to support slavery and to maintain slavery, and has never really since then said anything about, oops, our bad, nothing like that. And so that kind of set you off on your journey of discovery and moving into where you are now. So I'm excited because I followed Robby for a long time. And incidentally, just the way the worlds collide, I met Robby for the first time when I was dragged by friends to Pilgrim UCC in Carlsbad, and Madison Shockley introduced me to Robby. How crazy is that? Yes, so it just goes to show I can't get away with anything. So, all right. So, Robby Jones, here he is.
Up here, where am I? Here, and I'll bring you a stool.
Oh, great, okay.
And maybe you could just tell people a little bit about your background and then the topic of your current New York Times bestseller. Did we mention that it was a New York Times bestseller?
Thanks for that.
Okay.
It's like a music, I guess your musician promoter is coming out at you. Well, thank you all. Thank you. I don't actually lose a lot of height sitting on this. So thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here. I was in Phoenix 3 weeks ago when it was 112 degrees. So I am very happy to be back, and it feels like it's supposed to feel, I think, in October. But I'll tell you a little bit about my background. So my most recent book is called The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and The Path to a Shared American Future. And it is the third book in a series that, I wish I had enough foresight to call it a trilogy. It's only kind of looking back that it feels like kind of 3 books in a row that has been really about my working out this upbringing that I had. So I grew up as a Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi. My people, as we say down in the South, some of you may be transplanted Southerners, are actually all from Macon, Georgia. So both sides of my family go back into either Bibb County or Twiggs County, Georgia, about an hour and a half, or about a little bit over an hour south of Atlanta there. In fact, like the most prized possession I have for my mother's side of the family is actually a family Bible that was printed in 1815 that has been handed down from generation to generation from my mother's side of the family, that was from that family that immigrated from Virginia down to Bibb County and Twiggs County, Georgia. So that's kind of the deep roots. They were Baptists all the way back. All right, there were a few Methodists thrown in, but for the most part, they found their way back to the Baptist fold, but all the way back. And so, as David said, I grew up deep in that world. I was that kid who went to church like 5 days a week, because you could do that as a Southern Baptist in the South. 2 or 3 times on Sunday, Monday night we had like visitation. If you hadn't been to church in a couple of weeks, you might get a knock on your door from us. Tuesday night we had Bible study. Wednesday night we had kind of spaghetti dinner in the gym and prayer meeting. Thursday night we also had kind of like another sort of Bible study, and then Friday and Saturday were Sabbaths from church. That's kind of the way the rhythm worked growing up. And then I did go to public school in Jackson, Mississippi, and then went to a Baptist college, Mississippi College, and then to a Southern Baptist seminary. It was in Fort Worth, Texas, so just outside of Dallas there. And it was there that I really got the truth about. I always assumed the word Southern and Southern Baptist was a compass point, right? A geographical marker. That's all it just is. It's us down here, we're Southern Baptists, and those people up there, they're really Northern Baptists, even though they claim the word American Baptist in their denominational name, trying to kind of one-up us, I suppose, by claiming the whole country. But still, it just was, we're Southern because we're down here in the South. And I really, after all that time in being in church and all that time of being in Sunday school, hearing sermons, I never got an inkling, really, that it was about that the real history I finally got from a history professor at our Southern Baptist seminary that said, look, it was 1845, so it was before the Civil War, actually, that there was a controversy among Baptists in the U.S., and it was over whether someone who was an enslaver, owned slaves, could be appointed as clergy to the mission field. And that was the big fight between Baptists that ended up being the rift between Northern and Southern Baptists. The Southerners claimed, yes, that's perfectly okay. And the Northerners said, no, that's not. And that was the split. The Methodists, by the way, split the same year. You may remember that. The Methodist Episcopal Church South, for similar, that South meant the same thing over slavery. Virtually every Protestant denomination in the country split, it turns out. And the other thing that kind of became really clear to me in that little revelation at seminary was that the political split that led to the Civil War, that actually the churches, the white churches in the country, were the dress rehearsal for the political split. Like, we split first, right? And that actually kind of threw more fuel on the fire for the political split that led to the Civil War. So that's kind of been my kind of trajectory. It's been a very long kind of working out of, so what does this mean? It's kind of part of what's been, so in my day job, I'm the president and founder at this organization called Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, in Washington, D.C. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization that does a bunch of public opinion research. That's mostly what we do. We also do focus groups, other things. We're trying to understand, kind of have our finger on the pulse of what Americans think and believe at this intersection of religion, culture, and politics. Right? So I am the most dangerous cocktail party guest you could bring, because that's what I know and what I will probably talk about once the small talk runs out. So the kind of books I've been writing really since 2016 have really been trying to, over the last 10 years, make sense of this history. And so I wrote a book in 2016 called The End of White Christian America that was about the demographic shifts in the country and the fact that we have just experienced this shift from being really it's only been the last 20 years that we've gone from being a majority white Christian country to one that's no longer a majority white Christian country. So as recently as 2008, when our first African American president was running for office, we were 54% white and Christian. So if you took all white, non-Hispanic Christians in the country, Protestant, Catholic, non-denominational, et cetera, 54% of the country. By the time he comes out of office in 2016, that number has gone from 54 to 47. Today, that number is 41. Right, so we kind of this decline has really continued, but that means that's something I've often talked about. This as the Great White Christian Freakout that is engendered in the country. And so, if you're wondering, right, why white Christian people who look mostly like I think most of us would claim that label, why there's so much anger, right? Why is there so much angst? Why is there so much fear? Right? Part of it is because of this shift in the country of kind of a people, right, who we were used to this being our country, right? And suddenly finding that, oh, actually, we look around and, even demographically speaking, at least, we're no longer the majority. And what does that mean, right? Kind of great identity crisis, I think, that has kind of come upon us because of that. And then in 2020, I wrote a more autobiographical book called White Too Long. The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. That book begins with this confession that we were just talking about. That I just began it by saying, the Christian denomination which I grew up, had as its origins the claim that enslaving other people based on the color of their skin was compatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Right? That's the Genesis story. And then what makes that just not my story, but kind of the country's story, is that Southern Baptist convention eventually becomes, by the middle of the 20th century, the largest Protestant expression of Christianity in the country. So now think about that for a minute. With a group that has that origin, right, becomes the largest, most visible expression of Protestant Christianity. We outgrew the Methodists, in the early part of the 20th century, and we never merged back with our northern compatriots the way that the Methodists in the early part of the 20th century did remerge, right?
And we shouldn't have.
Came back together, yes. Well, and when you did it too, I should just say too, you did segregate all the black bishops into one jurisdiction to kind of keep them out of, water down their voting power with the other bishops. So it wasn't exactly a democratic or equitable merger when it happened. But all I'd say, so that book was really my trying to take seriously really two documents. One of them was this Bible that I've just already described to you. And it has that, that Bible. Some of you may have these old family Bibles. In between the Old and New Testament, there's these genealogical pages, right? And so in this kind of brown oxidized ink is handwritten, births, deaths, marriages, and a few random notes along the way. And so that Bible is about 4 generations of my family in it from Middle Georgia, back before the Civil War. In it, and it was inscribed to my 5th great-grandfather. His name was Pleasant Moon. It was a British name, a male British name. There's about 4 Pleasant Moons in that family tree. And what the other document, though, that I came upon was an estate settlement of his uncle for whom he was named. So he was the 2nd Pleasant Moon. And it just coincidentally, his uncle died the same year that Bible was printed. So both of these documents are from 1815. And it reads, "The goods and chattels of Pleasant Moon, deceased, 1815." And on that list is everything they owned. They had a 200-acre farm, which, by the way, they got when the Cherokee were forcibly removed from Georgia, right? And they started handing out free plots of land. They got the land through a land lottery. If you were white, you could come down, as we did from Virginia, and they would just hand out free plots of 200-acre plots of land. So that's how we got there. But in this estate settlement, it listed like all of their earthly goods, right? So it had like 1 bay mare, a kitchen, a table and 6 chairs, a feather bed, like all these things were listed. And then right in the middle of the list were 4 human beings, right? Sarah, a woman, at $400. Bird, a boy, at $150. And then it went on to other kind of things. And at the end of the tally, it was $2,000. So this tells you, like, we weren't the Gone with the Wind crowd, right? This was a kind of subsistence farm. It wasn't like that rolling, thousands and thousands of acres. It was 4 enslaved people. And if you take up that money and convert it to today's dollars, like all their earthly goods added up to be about $50,000 in today's. So that tells you they weren't wealthy, right? But the investments they had in those 4 human beings made up 70% of their assets, right? So that's how they made it work. That's how the economic model worked. So that White Too Long was really my wrestling with, what do I do with this legacy, right, of this family Bible passed down, and it is the most valued thing on my mom's side. Nothing else has come down except this Bible. And this testimony, this witness, right, that this is also the legacy, and that these people saw no contradictions between this treasured Bible and this, enslaving other people. They fit very comfortably together. Like, well, how do I make sense of that? And then the last book, I'll land the plane here, is the one, Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, where I've been hanging around with too many historians, Diana being one, and Kristin and Jemar, who will be there tonight, are all historians. So they've allowed me, kind of more of a sociologist, to hang out with them. But it has meant that I realized, like, the real value of history, kind of making sense of the present. And so in the most recent book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, I try to trace back even further than that story of my family in the early 1800s. But if we keep going back, how do we make sense of the kind of Christianity that lands on the shores? How do we understand the version of Christianity that lands on the shores of this country, like way, way back? And there I kind of trace our history back to 1493, which is really where we get the kind of Christian orientation toward the quote-unquote New World. Right? There's a whole set of documents called the Doctrine of Discovery that I won't go into too much detail, but essentially it was a theological crisis that set off with the early European discovery of the New World, right, which we now occupy. And the Christian response to that was to say, well, what do we European Christians, what do we owe these people, right, that are on these lands that we had no idea they existed, we had no idea these people existed? What do we owe them? And the answer the kind of theological answer that came down that really sets the moral compass for all of it, the whole colonial enterprise, the transatlantic slave trade, was they answered that question with a question, and the question was, well, are those people Christian? Well, of course, they knew the answer, right, to that. But if the answer was no, then it turned out that all kinds of things followed. And this is like down in like official theological documents from the Vatican, right? And it said, well, if they're not Christian, then it is the case that it's the church's position that the heathen nations be brought to Christ. And the way that we can do that is if they don't submit, then you could take their goods, you could take their land, and in the documents, right, it says, and you can submit them to perpetual slavery. Right? This is like right in the documents from the head of the people that Christians considered at the time, the vicar of Christ on earth, right, the Pope. And now I know most of us are Protestant in this room, so before you start feeling too smug about this being a Catholic problem, this is before the Protestant Reformation, right? So there are no Protestants in the world this time. If you're Anglican, this is before the split of the Anglican Church with the Catholic Church. So it is all Western European Christians are under the authority of the Pope, and this kind of comes down even through the Protestant traditions as well. So the new book is kind of wrestling with that legacy and trying to tell the story, as I just did with my family, of not only our legacy and entanglement with enslaving people of African descent, but our role in genocide and displacement of indigenous people as well, and the Christian theological foundations that made all of that seem okay. And that's kind of what I've been wrestling with in the book. And then the second part of the book is dealing with people, just like this, that were in very local places, trying to tell the truth about that history and bring about healing in their own communities. And the book, I go to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Many of you may have followed that story, right? The Tulsa Race Massacre. And behind that, which we also got with the Killers of the Flower Moon, the story of the Osage, right? And all, Oklahoma, as most of you know, is essentially the dumping ground for all of the Native Americans that got pushed out of the Southeast, right? This was like the refugee resettlement zone called Indian Country before it was Oklahoma there. And so that story, and then in Mississippi, tell three stories, one in Oklahoma, one in Mississippi, the story of Emmett Till. There are people trying to tell the truth about that in Mississippi. And behind that, the story of Hernando de Soto, right? And the kind of violence that was wrought on Native American people there. And then the last one was up in Duluth, Minnesota, where there was, this one not many people know about. There was a lynching in 1921 in Duluth, Minnesota, where 10,000 people turned out. And this is like an overwhelmingly white, mostly Lutheran and Catholic community turned out for this lynching in 1921. And also in Minnesota is the place where the largest mass execution ever carried out by the federal government occurred. And it was the execution in 1862 of 38 Dakota men executed by the federal government and signed off on by Abraham Lincoln, actually, there. So those but the stories in the second half of the book are about people trying to kind of reckon with that truth and tell a truer story about who we are, how we got here, in the hopes of bringing us to a place where we can, live, I think, into a more honest future together.
Cool. If you could all take a second and think about a short question that you'd like to ask, I'll be coming around with the microphone so that you can ask that if you indicate you have a question. While you're thinking about your question, I'm going to ask Robby to say a little bit about white supremacy and Christian nationalism and how they feed off of one another and are different and yet inexplicably connected.
A small question.
Just a small question. Yeah. That'll give them time to think of a question. Yeah.
All right. I'll try to make this as concise as possible. So white supremacy. When I'm talking particularly to white audiences, this is a term that I think we're hearing more now. But before 10 years ago, it's not a term that got a lot of usage, right? Particularly in white spaces. And I borrow a way of understanding this from my friend Eddie Glaude, fellow Mississippian, by the way, who's professor of religion at, if many of you watch Morning Joe, you may have seen him on Morning Joe a lot, yeah. He's professor of religion at Princeton. He and I actually, I can't resist telling the story, he and I ran against each other in 1985 as juniors in high school. I don't know if you know this story, but Eddie.
No, I don't
so,
know.
So Eddie and I, so he's from Mississippi, he's from Moss Point, I was from Jackson. He was the African American Democrat, and I was the white Republican. in this contest, and I was running. We were running for governor of the Mississippi Youth Legislature, and he kicked my ass in that election. I'll have you know, and he went on to become the first black governor of the Mississippi Youth Legislature there. But at any rate, where was I going with all of this? White supremacy. Yeah. So he, I think, has one of the best definitions of white supremacy. What he calls like white supremacy without all the bluster. It basically just is the idea that white lives matter more, right? And that now, he said that before the Black Lives Matter movement, so I think that automatically rings with like Black Lives Matter. But what he meant by that is just this very basic history of, so what's our history of public schools, right? We, for the longest time, reserved the best schools, the best teachers, the best textbooks, the best facilities for white people. What's our story with public libraries? It's exactly the same, right? Public pools, public parks, hospitals, right? All of these things, right? We have this like undeniable neighborhoods, right? The Color of Law, maybe you may have read that book about redlining and reserving kind of the best neighborhoods for only for whites. Just that idea that we've like very visibly and undeniably lived out in the country. So I think it's that sort of idea. It's tied up, I think, in this very old idea that I trace in the most recent book. That really is back to this old 500-year-old doctrine of discovery, right? This idea that these lands were intended by God to be a promised land for European Christians. Like it's that fundamental theological claim. Right, that's who these lands are for. And they were declared that way by God. And I think that's the marriage of kind of Christian nationalism and white supremacy. And in this country, it really has always been not just about racial supremacy. It's not always just been about Christian supremacy. It's always been this blend of the two. It's always been an ethno-religious claim, right, to power. One just kind of very quick kind of evidence of that. So I grew up in the South. I remember the KKK demonstrating like at our local parks, as I would go to our soccer games at the public parks, there would be people in sheets out there on the sidewalk passing out literature as we turned into the park to go to our soccer. And I had African American kids on our soccer team, so they had to go past this as we went to our soccer games. But if you ask the question of like, okay, we know the KKK was anti-black, right? That's very clear, kind of racial terrorist organization. But what we often forget is that the KKK was also anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish. Now, like, why is that, right? How do those three things hold together, being anti-black, anti-Catholic, and anti-Jewish? Well, you have to understand their positive campaign was to preserve America as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country, right? And so it was that, and that really has always been the impulse. This country is kind of a white Christian country. And I think that's why that number I began with, of this decline, and all of a sudden we're no longer a majority white Christian country, demographically speaking, why that has like set off the alarm bells, I think, so strongly among so many white Christians in the country.
Thanks. And just for clarification, here in Arizona, when Diana and I were babes in arms here in Phoenix, within our lifetimes, it was still illegal for blacks to live north of McDowell. So can you imagine? And just within the last 10 years, we've had a school in Tempe, where we'll be tonight, that had its name changed because it was named for an educator, principal, blah, 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 who it was discovered was part of the KKK. And so they changed the name of the school. So it's not just in the South. I mean, it's right here. So questions? Who has a question? You've answered everything. Yeah. Let's start with Carol.
Yes. My name is Carol. I'd like you to address the Christian nationalism movement and what can we do as individuals about that?
Let me say a little bit more about it. So we at PRRI, we've been actually studying, like trying to measure adherence to Christian nationalism. So how big is it? How's it distributed across different subgroups in the country? So I'll tell you a little bit about that, and then I'll get to the what can we do question. So we set out. There's actually quite a bit of good sociological, political science done to try to measure this over the last 5 years. And what we're finding is if we measure it with questions that are very much about not just kind of Christian involvement in public life, but about dominion. That's really what it's about. Like a kind of, so questions like U.S. laws should be based on the Bible. The U.S. should declare itself to be a Christian nation. The Christians should exercise dominion over all areas of American society. So we're measuring it using agree or disagree measures like that in public opinion surveys. When we do that, we kind of combine it all into kind of one composite measure using like 5 or 6 of these measures. We basically kind of 4 categories of people. And so we find the top 2 are kind of the ones we're talking about here, people who kind of are in agreement with those sentiments. And we find that there's like 1 in 10 Americans who will completely agree with all of those measures, like just absolutely, strongly, completely agree. And then there's about another 20% that agree but not as strongly. So we're really looking at about 30% of the country that is sympathetic to or fully adheres to this worldview of Christian nationalism. You can kind of boil it down to the vernacular, this idea that God intended this country to be a Christian nation or a kind of promised land for white or European Christians. So about 3 in 10 agree with that. That means that about 2/3 of the country either very strongly or somewhat strongly rejects that view. So that is maybe optimistic. It's all kind of a 1/3, 2/3 kind of divide essentially in the country. However, it doesn't divide evenly across different subgroups, and just a couple that really matter here. It is captured, because we live in a country that has only 2 political parties. It is become very unevenly distributed across the 2 political parties. And today, a majority of Republicans agree with that. So it's 30% of the country, but it's 55% of Republicans who agree with that statement. Among Democrats, it's down in single digits, right? So it's a very different there. And among white evangelical Protestants, those are kind of my people, the Baptists, the Assemblies of God, like those groups, it's 2/3 who agree with this white Christian nationalist sentiment, right? And I should say too, among white mainline Protestants, the kind of Methodists, Episcopalians, etc., it's still 40%, right, who agree with this worldview. So just under 40%. So it's not a non-existent view, right? Even among what we think of as a more progressive end of kind of the white Protestant world. So I think what can we do? I think that the biggest thing to do is, one, I would say it's a victory that we have a term that we can talk about this with, because that didn't actually exist more than 5 or 6 years ago. So that's a super helpful thing to say, like, there is this thing called Christian nationalism. We can measure it, we can see it, and this is what it sounds like, and this is who's representing it. And then the other thing to say is that it's just fundamentally anti-democratic, right? So I think that's the way, like in the last book, I put it this way, that we are disagreeing in our politics much less about policy. Like, we're not fighting about particular policies. It's much more about identities, these deeper identity issues. And I do think it's brought us back to these fundamental questions of democracy, which is why we're doing this thing. And it is the case, and it's always been the case, right, that we have struggled throughout our history. It has other incarnations. I think Christian nationalism is the right term for it in our current moment. But it again is this claim, right, that the country is a promised land for European Christians, and that's a fundamentally antithetical worldview to the alternative is the country as a pluralistic democracy, right, where everybody stands on equal footing, regardless of race, regardless of religion. And I think one of the things we can do is draw that contrast as strongly as we can, right? That it is not patriotic to be a Christian nationalist, right? It is anti-democratic to be a Christian nationalist. And I keep drawing those lines, I think, really clearly, and showing there's other tradition that this has always been in tension with is I think, pretty important. Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't. And I can certainly get. I'm not sure I can get the whole county, but I probably can. Yeah, we can look. Yeah, I can certainly. We have on our website, if you're interested, a map of support for Christian nationalism. It goes all the way down to state level. I'll have to double check and make sure I can get county level, but we can certainly get all the way down to the state level, and you can see kind of where Arizona sits, in the kind of grand scheme of things.
TJ, coming to you next. In the meantime, Jim, hate to gang up on you. Robby, former history teacher, but also a former legislator from Colorado.
By the way, I always remembered, you said earlier, 1493. I always had this thing, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492.
Yeah.
That was interesting. But anyhow, my real question.
I'll come back to that. It's important.
Okay. My real question is, we have wonderful, inspiring speakers, and we're confirmed in our views and feel so much better about it. But besides voting, what can each individual do to make sure that we have democracy in November?
Yeah, we're kind of back to the what to do thing. So one of the things that and this is about, I think, hope and things that Diana was, so eloquently talking about, and the kind of sustaining ourselves. And this is not a next 3 weeks question, right? I mean, this is a long haul question. And I think the perspective, and you took us all the way back to the Big Bang, right? Yes, right, all the way back. But I'm also realizing that the thing we're wrestling with, I mean, this idea that we're now calling Christian nationalism, is older than the country, right? Again, it is the version of Christianity that lands on the shores of this country. And so, and it has been nurtured and struggled against, but it has survived 500 years, right? So this is to continue to kind of disentangle this, and it is going to be a multi-generational fight. Right, and we may. So my wife's Jewish. We just got finished with the high holidays. Some of you may have observed as well. But there's this great line from the Mishnah that says, kind of like hope and endurance. It says, look, you're not responsible to complete the work, but neither can you desist from it. And I just always found that, it is. We may not see the death of Christian nationalism in our lifetime. Right, but it doesn't mean that we've got a role to play. And this moment, I think, is a really important moment for people like us, who look like us, those of you again who share this kind of white Christian identity. To, even if we are, as I understand we are in this particular area, a minority voice, it's a really important minority voice, right? And just the fact that people living in this area don't think, oh well, every church is on board with this Christian nationalist movement, and it normalizes it when that happens, right? But if there's some dissenting voice that's visible, that's clear, that's loud, as it can be, it does make a difference for folks, because it gives people, it creates a little bit of cognitive dissonance. It gives people, I've been in that world. Like, my journey is a pretty long one, right? And if it hadn't been for, that one Baptist history professor that told me the truth, I might still be doing the equivalent of running against Eddie Glaude as the white Republican, evangelical today. But those little moments, I think, make a difference. So, if you're librarians or teachers or whatever your sphere of influence is, it matters here. And so I think the thing of continuing to be that witness, we say that in my Baptist background, be a witness, right, to this alternative vision of what it means to be Christian and support democracy. That's kind of part of what we're trying to do here, is kind of give people space to kind of be that, to be that in the world. So 1493, I'll say real quickly that when I give a longer talk, I usually do start with that rhyme. Actually, I'm so glad you brought it up. I get people to chant, like in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean in blue. But today I usually say, well, I want to talk about 1493. Because 1493 is the year that we actually get one of the last papal bulls issued in this series of things that came to be called the Doctrine of Discovery. The first one's in 1452, the second one's in 1493, and it is in direct response to Columbus. So Columbus comes back, right, from his journey in 1492, pretty clueless about where he's been, by the way, right, on that first journey. But he goes back and he basically makes an appeal. And he says, look, I need more. We need to go back. We need to kind of do more exploration. And we need more ships, more troops, more missionaries. But the thing that people forget that he asked, and it always kind of gets written out of history, is that he also asked for a moral mandate for what he was doing, right? So not just power, but a kind of moral legitimacy to what he was doing. And so he appealed to the closest thing to international law that existed, and that was the church. Right? And so that's where this papal bull called Inter Caetera gets issued in 1493. And it is there that there is kind of yes to all of this other language that I already quoted, and more of this language of, we're blessing Columbus and his voyages, and this work to bring, the heathen nations under the authority of the church, right? And so it just gets kind of blessed. So 1493, for people who are kind of European descent and Christian identity, the year we really all have to have in our minds is not 1492, but 1493, because that's where it really gets cemented in kind of Christian theology for us.
For me, I mean, white supremacy, I've heard of white supremacy for years. It just seems like, yes, just recent, these words, Christian nationalism, seems to be more prevalent. And so I guess what I'm wondering is because we're seeing all of these changes that are happening, okay, in our schools, banning books, certain things not separating church and state, things that our legislatures are passing, okay? So can we contribute that to Christian nationalism? It just seems like the momentum is growing. When you say it's only 30%, I mean, that's not the majority, obviously, but they seem to be making a pretty big impact.
Well, do you want to do two before I? Okay, yeah. Yeah. I do think what's interesting here is it gets amplified in a couple of ways, right? So it is only 30% of the country that's like in on this worldview, but as I said, it is 55% of Republicans, right, who believe this, right? So it gets amplified. If we had 5 or 6 political parties, we would probably have a Christian nationalist party, and it would make up about a third of the country, and that's it. And then we'd have these other, but because we've only got like 2, it gets kind of amplified, right, up through this kind of binary political divide that we have in the country. The other thing to say is that conservative white Christians turn out to vote at pretty high rates in the country. And so even though, for example, you'll also be astonished by this, so white evangelical Protestants, the loudest, again, that's 2/3 in on this vision of the country, has shrunk similarly. To give just their numbers, that one white evangelical Protestant subset of white Christians have gone from being about a quarter of the country 20 years ago to being only 13% of the country. 13, that's all. Right now, you might not believe that because of how visible it all is, but it's 13.7%. That's it in the country today. And so, like, that's also, I think, a reason why. But in the last election, even in the 2020 election, they made up nearly 20% of voters, right? Because they turn out at rates higher than other Americans do. And so they get amplified at the polls. Like, one way I've thought about this is that, yes, the demographics are shifting in this kind of more pro-pluralism, more diverse way. But because white Christians tend to turn out at higher rates, the ballot box acts a little bit like a time machine. And it takes us back about 12 to 15 years, right, in terms of demographics. So the demographics of the country look like of people at the polls look about like the country did more than a decade ago, right? So there's this kind of time lag because of differential turnout rates that we're experiencing. So that's part of the answer as well.
I've often thought that Christian nationalism were politicians co-opting Christian language to their own ends. But if I hear you correctly, it's not that clean. It's much more a weaving of politicians of any stripe into Christian identity and political is much more tightly woven.
I think that's right. I don't think it's an invented sort of top-down thing. I mean, there are, like, I think one thing I was up to in the last book was trying to figure out, well, how far back does this go, right? And it turns out it was here from the beginning. I think that's the thing. And we've been kind of trying to extricate ourselves, right, from this. The struggles for separation of church and state. How do we understand that in this country? And the kind of opening up of democracy across the country. But I think that it's a real and very strong cultural tradition in this country. This claim that this is a European Christian country. That's not something new or invented. It's something we've struggled against, I think. And why now? I think it is because, again, back to my kind of great white Christian freakout moment, it's because, I think, of the changing demographics in the country, and we're finally being asked to make good on what we said we believed about pluralism in the country, right? So it's one thing to say, yeah, we believe in pluralism when your demographic group makes up 65, 70% of the country. It's quite another thing to say we believe in pluralism when your demographic makes up 41% of the country, right? I think that's what we're kind of dealing with and struggling with. At the end of the last chapter in The End of White Christian America, I gave this analogy, which I think still holds, trying to make sense of it all. And since you all probably do a lot of stuff around, sounds like end-of-life issues, many of you may be familiar with Stages of Grief, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book. And I actually found that helpful in kind of understanding in a social way what we're in. And so if you remember those stages, the first one, if I remember, first stage, right? Denial, right? And I think we've experienced some of that, right? A denial that the country's changing. Nope, looks just like it did in the 1950s. That's what the country is. And then the next stage is anger, right? And so what happens when the denial gets to be undeniable, right? You get angry, right? And you get angry because you feel like you've been cheated, that it's not fair, like all those kinds of visceral things. And I think that we can kind of take that as an analogy to white conservative Christians in particular who are grieving the loss of something they thought was theirs, right? That is the country. And if we take it that way, then I think we are kind of experiencing that we're somewhere between denial and anger, right? And then there's bargaining, right? Other kinds of things if you kind of go on. And at the end, if you get there, there's acceptance, right? But there's this kind of nonlinear and kind of messy process. But I think we're stuck right now somewhere between kind of denial and anger in that process.
All right, I think we have time for, I see 2 questions, so make them quick.
The Wall Street Journal recently published an article, and I'm just going to read from it, about the racial identity of Americans is rapidly blurring. And I thought it was a fascinating article because Christian nationalism, to me, is Europeans, is European-based, Europeans coming over. I can't help but think that that's our ray of hope. And so if you can respond to that.
So we see this certainly on public opinion surveys where we are offering multiple categories. So one has changed the practice of even how we measure these things at the census and other. It's very complicated to try to figure out how to do this well. You look at even like public figure, like look at Kamala Harris, right? Mixed race, interreligious marriage, like blended family, like it's all this stuff, right? But I think more and more that's what the country looks like. And we're seeing more and more people not check just one racial category, like they might check white, they might check black, and then they might also check mixed, multiracial, mixed race or multiracial on there. And we're seeing the same thing with religion, by the way, too, that the religious lines are blurring. How many of you in here grew up United Methodist? And so that's like maybe less than half, it looks like. So I think this has got one small indicator of that. But when we ask people today on public opinion surveys whether they are the believer and practitioner of more than one religion, not just a denominational thing, it's almost 1 in 5 Americans who say that they practice more than one. They themselves practice more than one religion. So like those lines are blurring. Intermarriages sort of going up, particularly among younger people. Across both racial and religious lines. And I think you're right. That will make it harder and harder to carve out the us and them boxes as we go. But I will say before that blurring is terrifying to people who believe, right, that we ought to all stay in our little boxes. And I can't tell you, if you read, history in the South, the word miscegenation, right? The mixing of the races, like, oh my God. If you wanted to end an argument, that's all you had to do was like raise that one point. And it was like a conversation stopper for the longest time, right? do you want your daughter? Like that's all you had to say, and then it would like shut down the conversation. But I think that is part of the thing. Is this a ray of hope, or is it like the end of history, right, on the other side of that? And I think that's part of one of our big dividing lines. Yeah.
Well, you commented on Kubler-Ross and that we're in the anger phase, which anger is usually fear. Is there any way we can diffuse that fear?
I hope so. I mean, one of the things that I see in that fear narrative is what I just half jokingly said, like it's the end of history. It's an apocalyptic narrative, right? Of literally the end of everything. That's the fear talking, right? How many times we heard, if this happens, we're not going to have a country anymore, right? Like that kind of language, is really the end of everything as we know it. And so there's a kind of rhetoric of rupture that I think does lend people. It gets people in their corners. It gets them kind of locked in, doubling down, tripling down. And I think that's one thing. But we have another narrative, and that's a narrative of continuity, right? I mean, in some ways, there are precedents for us navigating these waters. I mean, you think about like the early part of the 20th century, there's huge anti-Catholic, anti-Chinese sentiments in the country. And part of what's interesting is that it does seem like whenever we get to a threshold of being about 15% foreign-born residents, we freak out. And so that was true in the early part of the 20th century. And then we had all this legislation to kind of lock down immigration and restrict it to European countries. And by the sort of 1950s, the foreign-born part of the population had gone down to about 5 or 6%. But then in 1965, we had an Immigration Act that began to open up immigration again, and we're now back up around 14% foreign-born residents. So I think there's part of that cycle going on, but to kind of tell that story, like, look, we reacted in some pretty terrible ways before, but we've found a way that this country is not, we're not. I mean, that used to be a point of pride. Like we're not Germany, right? You don't have to be German ancestry to be a full-fledged citizen, right? But that's not the kind of country we are. And kind of, I think telling that as a point of pride, I think re-embracing that narrative and to say like, look, this is hard, what we're trying to do. To really be a pluralistic democracy, that is not an easy thing to do, right? But that's something we could actually take pride in, kind of struggling and building toward.
Just very quickly, not even a question, just locally, when we're talking about voting for things, the whole school voucher program is really a project of white Christian nationalism. So, that's almost $1 billion of your tax money going into supporting this idea. Lastly, Hidden Roots is, Robby is a statistics guy, but this is not a statistics book. It reads like a novel. So I highly recommend it. You will not see the world in the same way after you read it.
That's very kind. Thank you.
I've been an advocate for Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. That's au.org. You can find out more about them online. We've got some stuff on the back table there. This is a group that I've worked with for years to try and raise awareness of where the line is between we as Christians being able to speak out for certain issues, for justice, for compassionate political policies and things like that, without crossing that church-state line. I mean, am I saying it clearly enough? It just needs, that's another place where you can get involved. Go to AU and sign up, get their newsletter. They send you ways that if there's legislation in front of the Arizona State Legislature that you can write a letter about, they will send you an email saying, write a letter. In fact, here's the letter you can send. Just sign it and send it, And then that's something that you can do and feel like you're a part of what's going on. Another thing is to sign Christians Against Christian Nationalism. There's a great statement out there online. Just Google Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Get on that list. They also will send you information about how you can be a witness, hear that Baptist word, to really get out there. So, Diana, do you have any closing words about this evening or encouragement or whatever?
You know, I love listening. I love listening to Robby. It would be nice if you knew a little bit of the connection between us, and that is, I wound up moving to Washington D.C. around the year 2000, and that's where I've been for most of the career that I've been a public writer. I got to know Robby, and I can't even remember when this happened, but it was sometime in the mid-aughts that he showed up at an event that I led at the Washington National Cathedral, and he gave me a copy of his very first book, which was a book on progressive Christians or progressive religious leaders. And we just sort of got to know each other, and he then began to tell me about this crazy idea he had of starting a polling organization. And he eventually invited me to be on the board of Public Religion Research. So I was on the founding board. We've worked together very closely since 2009, me as a historian, learning from the sociologists. So he always is so nice about historians, but I have to be nice about sociologists. So I did that with Robby for 10 years, and I can't speak more highly to this man's skill and his vision and his passion that you can actually have things that are factual and true, and that if you put out that kind of information in the world, it makes a difference to how we live our lives. And that is something that I think I have learned to treasure even more through our friendship, Robby. So thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Let's thank Robert P. Jones. Thanks so much, and we will see you next week for the Reverend Madison Shockley. So
Please do join our email list, and
Yes.
we'll be sharing those email addresses.
Email list is on the back green table, so sign up.